When I was thinking about how do you end up with 4,000 of them, even if I told you guys I wanted you to go find me 4,000 squirrels, you could probably bring them to me next week or in a couple of weeks, but it would take an organized effort. You know, you're not just going to be able to go out and find all of those, collect all of those things. So having 4,000 of anything is an indication that there's definitely a lot of people involved and a network involved, especially when they're all ending up in one warehouse location. So that's a little disconcerting for the future of the species if that network is not broken. It's good to see so many people interested in turtles or wildlife conservation in general. I was fortunate to be able to participate in this expedition to the Philippines last summer. I'm going to show you the details of that tonight. But in general, I really wanted to use this also as just a forum for discussion and bringing awareness to all of you about the global wildlife trade. I bet a lot of you already know about this and you're here because of it. This is the cover issue of the September National Geographic that focuses on one of the really well-known wildlife trade issues, the ivory trade in Africa. And as just an introduction in National Geographic in basically the front of the magazine, it's written, the thriving global illegal wildlife trade, including sales of endangered species and products made from them, is worth billions of dollars annually. The trade not only kills elephants, turtles, crocodiles, and other animals, it also brings big bucks to smugglers, crime syndicates, and terrorists. In a 2013 executive order aimed at combating wildlife crime, President Obama called the surge in poaching and trafficking an international crisis that is fueling instability and undermining security. If any of you have any doubt about how devastating wildlife trade is and how it's related to war and lots of other political and social problems, if you read this Nat Geo article about the ivory trade, it's really quite horrifying. In addition to the really well-known things, I know everybody heard about Cecil the lion being killed, and I was a little disappointed in that the whole world was focusing on this one lion being killed when there's all these other animals being killed and smuggled and poached on a weekly basis. But it did bring attention to it. But there's so many other animals around the world. Right now, there's a big market for this type of animal called pangolins, which are a rare mammal species. They're found in Africa and Southeast Asia. And there's big markets in Southeast Asian live animal markets now for pangolin. Also, a lot of the bird species. This is a picture of the Philippine cockatoo that I got to see while I was in the Philippines. There are very few of these animals left in the wild. Most of them have been captured by poachers for the international live bird trade. Turtles also feature in the international trade. Some of you may have heard about this Asian turtle crisis. It was widely publicized starting in the late 1990s that as the middle class was growing in China, the demand for live turtles and turtle products in China was growing. And this created a network of collectors throughout Southeast Asia that were paying local people in various countries to collect live turtles, funnel them through channels, and these turtles would eventually end up in markets in big cities like Jakarta and Hong Kong. It is a large, unsustainable harvest. Turtles do not deal well with being removed from their populations as adults. You can take little baby turtles when there's hundreds and hundreds of babies born. Some of those turtles are going to die naturally anyway. But once they go through their life and mature to adulthood, which can take 20 or 30 years, removing those adults from the population is really devastating. So this has been a major setback for a lot of the turtle species that live in Southeast Asia. The markets for these are both for live animals for use for food, sale as pets, and also medicinal use. Various parts of turtles, the turtle shell or some of their internal organs, are turned into powders and sold for theoretically medicinal purposes. And in general, in Southeast Asia, there's very little concern for the conservation status of any individual turtle species. So you're just as likely to find a very common species for sale in a market as you are to find an endangered species for sale in a market. The pet trade revolving around turtles is also really lucrative for dealers. There are some turtle and tortoise species that are quite rare, and the only way you can get them is to buy illegally smuggled animals. And there are turtle and tortoise collectors around the world that will pay $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for a single individual of a particularly rare species. And just to say that it's not just an Asian issue. The United States is as bad as anybody else when it comes to live turtles. We, although we may not be collecting them and selling them here locally, so obviously the U.S. exports lots and lots of turtles to meet the needs of the Southeast Asian markets right now. And individual states have been responding to this over time by trying to improve their state wildlife laws to prevent harvesting of turtles to be sold, but it's still happening. These are some pictures provided by our colleague Chris Hagan, who works for a group called the Turtle Survival Alliance. And Chris has been to a lot of these Asian food markets to document the presence of endangered species. This picture shows two types of box turtles in the genus Coora. They're both critically endangered turtles, Coora galbinifrons and Coora mahudai. Just another example here of crates and crates of turtles in these live animal markets. So as a result of the Asian turtle crisis and also problems here at home with habitat destruction, turtles being hit by cars, turtles across the world are not doing well in general as a species, as groups of species. There's about 300 turtle species that we recognize now as valid species, and about 2/3 of those are under some sort of conservation threat. And locally here, even our native species, the majority of turtle species that are found in Massachusetts are now state listed as threatened or endangered. The spotted turtle is the guy that you see on your left, and this is a box turtle. The photographer of this turtle is actually in the audience. Where are you? He's not raising his hand. Anyway, this is a box turtle down in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, a beautiful native species. And both of these species are on the decline and probably, there he is up and back, will probably continue to decline over time. So the species that we worked on in the Philippines, the Latin name is Cybinrocchiella latensis. The common name that's used now is the Palawan forest turtle. This is a species that was poorly known up until only about 15 years ago. If you look in some of the older turtle books, not even that old, but books when I was a kid in the late 70s and 80s, it describes just this is a rare species. We don't know almost nothing about it, and there were only 4 specimens in museums to even let scientists know that this species existed. But around 2001, some surveys were being done in the Philippines, and they actually determined that this turtle that had been mysterious for so long is actually native to this island, Palawan, which is one of the Philippine islands. They found them there by noticing these live animals in captive settings in live animal markets. Since then, it's been determined that the turtle really only lives in the northern half of Palawan, which is about the size half the size of the land area of Connecticut. So when you start thinking about the numbers of turtles that I'm going to show you that are being harvested out of this area, it wouldn't be that difficult to lead to extinction of a species like this whose native range is so restricted on an island. And because of this, they are now listed by the IUCN as critically endangered, and that categorization means that it's a species in imminent danger of extinction. This is the Philippine Islands that's circled here. It's north of Australia, east of the rest of Asia. And there was a lot of military activity in this area during World War II, so a lot of Americans are familiar with this area. Palawan is this little strip of island right here. So this whole thing is the Philippines, but this is the island of Palawan. And this turtle species is restricted to the north. So Puerto Princesa, which is the main city in Palawan, is down in the south, and the range of this turtle really is up here in the north. This is what they look like. They're really pretty in a subtle sort of way. They've got this sort of pink and orange on their head. They have this bright white stripe around their neck, and then the remainder of their shell is mostly a mahogany brown to sometimes ivory color. This is an adult male. The males of the species, when they're fully mature, get this kind of large head with an upturned nose. It's one way that you can tell the sexes apart. And this is their habitat. They live in these pretty densely forested streams. They're mostly nocturnal. They spend their days in burrows along the banks of these streams, and then they come out into the water and the adjacent land at night. The water temperature in these forested streams is fairly low when you think that the Philippines is basically an equatorial climate where you'd expect 90-degree temperatures. The water here is actually only in the low 70s, and the forest, the true forest that normally should be shading these streams, keeps their temperature low. So these turtles don't deal well with high temperatures or direct sunlight exposure. We know a little bit about their reproductive strategy. They only lay one egg at a time, sometimes two, which is a little bit unusual. There are some turtles that do this, but compared to like snapping turtles or sea turtles that lay many, many eggs all at once, there's very few species that only lay one egg at a time. And to do that, they lay a relatively big egg, and they put a lot of maternal investment into the development of a larger egg relative to some of the other turtles that produce smaller eggs. This picture is a hatchling of this species. On Palawan, like a lot of other places that have developing economies, one of the more lucrative things that you can do if you want to make money is agriculture. And so there's a lot of deforestation happening here. These are just a couple of images, the next two slides, of areas that I got to photograph as we were driving around, where you could see clear agricultural areas being cleared of trees. Another trade here is making charcoal, and as they're clearing these forests, they're using all the wood that's left behind to make charcoal that they can sell. And then they'll plant these areas usually with rice, or they'll be grazing cattle here. And as you know from deforestation discussions in general, this is really harmful to biodiversity, and it's difficult ever to regain the true diverse forest that you had prior to clear cutting. This is another area as I'll show you later, we were up on a mountain going towards a release site at one point. This is taken down from the ridge of one of the mountains to a big area where the trees had all been felled. I told you that the turtles live in burrows. The burrow is actually in the lower part of this image here. This is the natural burrow that the turtles go up into, and this is a burrow that is made by the poachers. They know that the turtles live in these areas, and they'll just come by and make a hole in the bank so that they can reach in to the turtle burrows and grab turtles. We were also told that another method to be able to collect these is just to cut up mangoes or papayas or whatever fruits they have and put them in shallow areas along the streams, and then go back at night, and they can often find dozens of turtles in a very small area feeding on the fruit, and it's very easy to collect them. This is Sabine's shop. She's a major player in this whole story. Sabine is a German by birth, but she went to the Philippines as a grad student a couple decades ago, and learned to speak the language and met all of the people and just stayed there forever. And she has a home there, and she works at Western Philippine University and trains Philippine students in the ways of the turtle. So she's a really important person there, and it's her organization, the Katala Foundation, that really is driving most of the turtle and cockatoo conservation work on Palawan. So the Katala Foundation started seeing an increase in illegal trade of the Palawan forest turtle in late 2014. Prior to that, they had been studying the turtle in its natural habitat, documenting their reproductive cycles and natural history, but there was no real evidence of illegal trade in the species. And then in late 2014, they started finding confiscations of 20 or 30 or 40 turtles at a time. And they started to get information that there were outsiders coming to Palawan and going to all of the local towns and telling townspeople that we'll come back in a month and we'll buy any live pangolins, porcupines, cockatoos, turtles that you can provide to us. And for people that are making relatively low amounts of money raising crops or making charcoal, this is an attractive opportunity. Especially if they don't have a good understanding of how rare some of these species are on a global scale. They may just think that, oh, these turtles in the stream in the woods, I can get money for, but they don't realize that globally it's a very rare species. So the real eye-opening moment was in June when this massive confiscation occurred. The government had some information that there were more organized activities trying to gather large numbers of these turtles for export. And the next couple slides I'm going to show you are just the number of turtles that were confiscated in mid-June. This was one truckload that was found at the warehouse. These turtles are packed several feet deep. And as you'll see later, just that amount of crowding and pressure on top of each other and urinating on each other and all sorts of issues caused lots of medical problems for them. This is another one. So Sabine was completely shocked by this. The total number that was confiscated ended up being 4,312 turtles. And she didn't even think that the total population on the island was that large. She had been doing surveys for this species for a long time and thought that there maybe were a couple of thousand of these turtles in the wild. And to find 4,000 of them having been collected illegally was quite a shock to everyone. When I was thinking about how do you end up with 4,000 of them, even if I told you guys I wanted you to go find me 4,000 squirrels, you could probably bring them to me next week or in a couple of weeks, but it would take an organized effort. You're not just going to be able to go out and find all of those, collect all of those things. So having 4,000 of anything is an indication that there's definitely a lot of people involved and a network involved, especially when they're all ending up in one warehouse location. So that's a little disconcerting for the future of this species if that network is not broken. So once the confiscation happened, it took a day or so for the communication to get out of the Philippines, but Sabine put out a call for veterinarians with turtle experience to go to the Philippines and help deal with this confiscation. We know from other turtle confiscations that have happened over the years that turtles in these situations are very sick most of the time. They have infectious diseases, pneumonia, bacterial septicemia, all kinds of issues, and so they do need veterinary care in most cases. So I called my boss, Mark Smith, here, and he called our CEO, Nigella, and within the same day of getting the email, the aquarium had approved for me to go for 2 weeks and to pay for me to do so. So congrats to the aquarium for standing up for all of this. I left the next day on June 20th, and it's about a day's trip to get there. You usually have to fly around to the other half of the world to someplace like Hong Kong or Jakarta or Manila, and then you can get a second plane to get you to Palawan. So, and then with the time change, you're into the next day pretty quickly anyway. So it was June 22nd by the time that I arrived there. While that was happening, the IUCN is sort of an international group of scientists that oversees conservation issues, and their tortoise and freshwater turtle specialist group met and basically wrote a letter to all of us that were responding, saying that their desire was for these turtles to be evaluated and for any that were still in good condition to be released back to the wild as soon as possible. And that's a little bit counterintuitive. Some of you that have dealt with confiscated animals in the past know that we often are very careful about releasing them back to the wild, especially if they've gone to some other part of the world and then they were confiscated. So for example, if these turtles had made it all the way to Hong Kong and they were sitting in a food market with other animals from all over Southeast Asia, we might not have been able to release them back to the wild, because once they mix with other animals and diseases from other places, we're very hesitant to put those animals back into their natural habitat. The good thing in this case was that these turtles had never left the island that they were native to, and they were not mixed with other species. And so we felt comfortable releasing ones that were healthy enough back to the wild. The other issue with this species is they're not really a gregarious species. They're quite aggressive towards each other. If you put two in a small enclosure, they'll start fighting almost immediately, and sometimes to the point that one will kill the other one. So it's very challenging once they feel healthy to maintain big groups of these in captivity. So there was no way that we were going to be able to maintain several thousand turtles in captivity until they were deemed completely healthy and able to go back. So keep that in mind when we talk about the the management that we did and the fact that we released a lot of them. This was the little airport on Palawan. Palawan actually is a well-known diving destination. If any of you are scuba divers, it's really known in Southeast Asia as one of the nicest places to go for a diving expedition. It's easy enough to get there, and they do have infrastructure there for tourism. It's a pretty small airport, and even the city, Puerto Princesa, has a couple 100,000 people, but it's still pretty underdeveloped in general. A lot of the buildings are these sort of bamboo and palm frond roofs, sheet metal, plywood. There are some real buildings, as you'll see. There's hotels and shopping malls that have American businesses in them, but for the most part, most of the buildings are these little, relatively undeveloped things. This is the police station. And the most common transportation, this is just an aside, is kind of a gee whiz thing. They take their motorcycles and they turn them into tricycles. They add an extra wheel off the back on one side, and then they build these kind of metal frames around them. And then they customize them. There's, people have their names painted in all different cool patterns on them. And these things are flying around the streets at speeds that are really scary to us Americans, I'd say. Regular motorcycles are another common form of transportation too, and there seems to be very little safety standards about this. Nobody wears helmets, and you'll see like a family of 4 with the dad driving the bike, the mom on the back, the toddler in between, and then the mom with a baby on her hip hanging over the side of the motorcycle. So that was kind of interesting, just as part of the cultural experience there. The hotel that we stayed in is actually a training center for the hospitality industry to try to increase the tourism business here, which could be of benefit to the environment. So this is run by Holy Trinity University. The Catholic Church owns this, and the nuns run this. And all of the students that are in this program are the receptionists and wait staff and management of this hotel. So that was kind of neat. The back of this hotel had a beautiful deck that looked out over the mountains and this saltwater lagoon. And there was beautiful sunrises, sunsets here. And at night, just at dusk, when it was just dark enough that you could barely see anymore, there were flying foxes, these big bat-like creatures that would come out of the forest and cross the lagoon in front of us. That was pretty cool. All of these turtles that were confiscated were transported to this center. This is the Palawan Wildlife Rescue and Conservation Center. This was built in the 60s, initially focused on crocodile conservation. They were breeding various crocodile species here. And so it's functional, but it's old school. It's kind of like Jurassic Park looking stuff that's gone through some weathering. So these are old concrete pools with chain link fence and barbed wire around the top and rust and breaking down. And so it's not ideal, as you'll see in some of the photos. The group of vets that got there first included me. Sonia Luz is from Wildlife Reserve Singapore. Paulo and Carti Martelli from Ocean Park Center in Hong Kong. Paul Gibbons is an American colleague that works out at the Baylor Center in California that's employed by the Turtle Conservancy. And Na Wen was a Vietnamese veterinarian that's employed by the Bronx Zoo crew, the WCS out of New York. And she was one of the first one there too. And then Chris Hagen from Turtle Survival Alliance. So you can see already it's quite a diverse group of people and quite a network of people that are coming in. And that just kept getting more and more expansive as time went on. The bottom photos just show some of the initial triage. We just had buckets full of turtles. And we spent the first couple of days going through the turtles, finding ones that truly did need medical care versus ones that looked relatively healthy and probably could be released sooner. These are just some images of the enclosures that we had to work with. It's not ideal to keep turtles in concrete pools. It's not good on their shells, especially when they're crowded and already have problems. So we tried to line the pools as much as possible with these plastic tarps. And then put water in with turtles in each one. We also installed these shade cloths that you see because of the exposure of these pools to direct sunlight. These turtles, as I said earlier, don't like direct sunlight. We got a lot of help from the students from Western Philippine University, and hopefully some of the efforts that they went through during this will help them in their future conservation careers on the island. You can see in the foreground here, we had a generator pump. We had to drain the pools using this pump every day because there was no electricity at the site, and there was no running water at this site either, so we had to have a tanker truck come in every day with fresh water to be able to do water changes for the turtles. So this is us draining one of the ponds, moving turtles from place to place, counting turtles, removing dead ones, bringing in the tanker truck. This is a plant that grows there, like a water spinach type thing. It's called kangkong, and it is very edible for humans. I'll show you that later, but it's also one of the favored food items of these turtles. And it's pretty abundant on the island, so we would get 50-pound bags of these brought in every day, and then we could scatter the plants into the holding pools to provide cover for the turtles and also to provide food for them. We tried using some of these larger concrete pools. They were challenging just because of how deep they were. It was tough to get in and out of them, and it was tough to find the turtles once we put them in there, but it did work. This is Chris Hagen installing shade cloth. These are some of the back forested enclosures that we used, and once the turtles were in there, they tended to start to resume some of their more normal behaviors if they were healthy. This is a turtle just up on a log basking a little bit. So we continued just for the first couple of days to examine turtles. This is Paul Gibbons and Paula Martelli doing turtle exams and separating them out. I think you can start to see in some of these images that we're using nail polish to put colored spots on their backs, and we had a code where white dots meant the turtles were in good shape and were releasable, red was in need of medical attention, and pink was almost dead. And a pink cross was really almost dead. And then as time went on and some turtles improved, they would get additional dots, and ideally their dots were going from pink cross to pink to red to white. So within the first 3 days of evaluating turtles, we took about roughly half of the confiscation and deemed them okay for immediate release without any veterinary care. And those started to be released by Sabine's team, as I'll show you later. The remainder had problems, and so we kept them on for veterinary care. A lot of the turtles had corneal problems on their eyes. So the cornea is a very sensitive tissue. It's sensitive to scratching, abrasion, chemical injury from things like urine. So we saw a lot of these turtles with these opaque white corneas that over time improved, but they did need ophthalmic treatment on a daily basis to get them to improve. So any turtles that had these really severe eye problems were held back for further treatment. Another issue we saw with these pretty severe shell infections. This one is bleeding and has lost some of the bone of the shell. We attribute this to a couple of things. One is just the sheer amount of force that these turtles were under when they were stacked on top of each other for who knows how long. They're normally in water and buoyant, and they just are not used to having that amount of pressure on their shell. So pressure probably contributed to this. But we also know that turtles that are under such stressful conditions have a poor immune response, and when they're in environments that are very dirty like they were, bacteria that are normally in their environment can get into parts of their body where it shouldn't otherwise be, and these bacteria can get into their shell, it can get into their lungs. I'll show you later, it gets into places like their gallbladder. So these shell infections were pretty severe, and we thought that turtles that had these severe lesions should at least be treated for several weeks before they were released. Some of them were really severe, full thickness all the way through, where the shell had, where the infection had penetrated all the way through, exposing the internal tissues of the turtle. Another common lesion we saw that made turtles need care was these swollen feet, and you can imagine being stacked on top of each other and trying to extricate themselves. They probably were just constantly putting a lot of force on their feet, and so we saw a lot of nails that had been ripped out, digits that were semi-amputated, and just generalized swelling of the feet. And we know from work that we do in the US with captive turtles that often this means that there's infection that's up into the bones of the feet. So these were some of the things we could see externally that led us to believe that a lot of these turtles needed treatment. And then we also started doing necropsies, which is basically a dissection or autopsy of a dead turtle. We didn't have a place to do it, so I started the first necropsies on like the 4th day we were there, and we just selected a place that was far away from where the live turtles were. We found this corner in the back of the facility, and just we had nothing really to work on, so we bought a hammer and a chisel at the local hardware store to open the turtle shells up, and we just did it on the ground, and there were flies everywhere, and it was a mess, but we had to do it to find really what else was going on. So I'll warn you, if you want to close your eyes for like the next few slides, I'll tell you when to open them again, but I'm going to show you some internal turtle images with disease. The first image I'm going to show you is the colon of a turtle, and normally a colon should be a relatively smooth pink structure on the inside. This image that I'm going to show you has all of these yellow nodules throughout the surface of the colon, and these sort of mottled purple to red areas. This is a very severe form of colitis, and when we looked closer at these nodules, these are granulomas, which are an infectious, inflammatory process that we see in turtles a lot. These were caused by nematodes, little worms that were living in the colon. Normally, in the wild, animals have parasites and they don't cause a huge problem to a healthy animal, but when the animal is under a stressful situation, and especially if they're not eating well, these parasites may increase in number and cause severe disease. So this lesion in itself can be fatal for a turtle. Once you have colitis that's this severe, you're losing fluids, you're developing secondary bacterial infections, and then these infections spread through the rest of your body. Keep your eyes closed. This is an infected gallbladder. This whole brown tissue here is the liver of this turtle. This is the gallbladder. Gallbladder should be a thin membrane that's almost transparent, and it should contain bile, which is green. So normally when we see a gallbladder, it's just a sort of little bag, balloon-looking thing that's filled with green fluid. When we cut this one open, it's filled with this cheesy material that we refer to as caseous material, which is another typical reptile inflammatory infection response. So this is most likely a severe infection of the liver and the gallbladder. You can see the fly on the liver there too, just to add a little flair. Okay, you can open your eyes now. So these just showing again the drawings that we made. This is a turtle that initially was deemed critically almost dead, and then the next time he was evaluated, he got a red dot indicating that he was improving. So we treated about 2,000 turtles over the course of time. We gave them fluid therapy and nutritional supplementation by putting a tube down their esophagus and delivering fluids and food directly to their stomach, because we know that they're not going to be feeling well enough to eat very much on their own. We also started most of them on antibiotics if it was indicated, and antiparasitic drugs based on our necropsy findings of all of these parasites in the colon. And then most of them also needed topical treatments with ophthalmic medications and topical treatments of their skin and their shell. With some of the antibiotics that we use in reptiles, we can dose them every 3 days and still maintain effective drug concentrations in their body. So that gave us the opportunity to divide these 2,000 up into groups of roughly 700, where we only had to treat about 700 per day instead of having to treat all of them, which was helpful. And the other thing is, once you start a reptile on antibiotics, or any animal for that matter, you usually don't want to just give one dose of antibiotics, because sometimes you'll partially treat the infection and then some of the more resistant bacteria are still there, and then they start to overgrow if you don't continue your treatment. So we decided that we wanted to do at least 3 doses of treatment, which would give us a 10-day course of therapy, which even for a reptile is a pretty short treatment dose, but it's at least more reasonable than only doing 1 dose. So these 2,000 turtles that we decided to care for, we had plans that they would stay with us at least 10 days. And then we got a lot more help. The WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, sent 5 more people from their New York facility, including a veterinarian, a veterinary pathologist, a veterinary technician, and 2 just sort of very helpful administrative people that work in their hospital in New York. So this is our morning meeting once everybody arrived. We usually sort of plan the day on who was going to be doing necropsies and who was going to be doing treatments and who was going on the release expeditions. And we set up our little stations. We usually had an assistant and one veterinarian at each station. Medications would be made up in the morning, and we each would just go and sit down and just start processing turtles one at a time until all 700 had been treated each day. This is just an image of tube feeding a turtle. This is pretty straightforward. If you've never seen this before, it's not as bad as it seems. The hardest part of this often in strong turtles is just getting their head out and getting their mouth open. But weak turtles, it's pretty easy to do that. You hold them on the side of the jaw behind their head and just put a little bit of gentle pressure and their neck will extend out. And then you use these feeding tubes that you just pass gently down over the back of their tongue, down their esophagus. And you can, once you've done this a bunch of times like I have, you get very fast at it. It's very straightforward, and it takes maybe like 15 or 20 seconds to do it. So it's a good way to get fluids into them and get a good nutritional dose into them. And then eventually things started settling down, and once we were through that initial triage stage, we were able to do some more of the science that we'd like to do. We were getting people from all over the world emailing us saying, you know, like, it would be great if you can get 1,000 genetic samples for us. And it's like, you know, well, we're just trying to keep them alive right now. So we eventually ended up getting measurements and weights on the majority of them. We collected blood from about 50 of them, so we are going to be able to evaluate genetics on those samples and do standard veterinary blood analyses on those. And we were also, as time went on, we were releasing turtles, and that meant we had fewer turtles to treat each day, and we could focus their treatment more specifically on what their individual problems were. This is just showing Lisa from WCS with her laptop recording information that Chris and Na are throwing at her about taking measurements on these turtles. This is Na and John Sykes from WCS doing a blood collection from a turtle, and then later that day, John and I sat in our hotel room and ran hematocrits, which is a test we use to check for anemia in turtles and other animals. And we also saved plasma from all of these turtles to be able to do biochemical analyses. And as time went on, when we were gearing up to leave, there was another team that came in from San Diego Zoo and some European and Asian facilities to continue the work. So. And we felt it was really important, and it was great to see a lot of the young Filipino college students were very interested in what we were doing and were there with us on a daily basis. And it was interesting that they were some of the only Filipinos that came by. We were hoping that we would be seeing veterinarians or government officials, and I'll talk about this a little more at the end, but there were some political overtones that we were sensing here where it was clear that this whole endeavor was not wholeheartedly embraced by everyone that was there from a political standpoint. And so, you know, you would hope that with all these trained Western veterinarians there that we could have taught a bunch of Filipino veterinarians how to do this so we never have to go back to do it again. But nobody else showed up other than these very young students from the local college, and they were really helpful. And over time, your goal is to get turtles looking like this. This is a little feisty guy that you can see originally had his pink cross on top, and then one day you go to treat him and he's ready to bite your finger. So that's a good sign that we're ready to move on. So we selected our release criteria. Sabine was choosing release sites within the natural range of the turtle. She didn't want to mix these potentially sick turtles in with her known study turtles that she'd already been following over time. We also didn't want these release sites to be really accessible. We wanted to have relatively, you know, a low profile for people to know what was going on. And we tried not to put all 4,000 turtles at one site. So in the end, there were 13 release sites that were used. The turtles were put in these crates for their rides to release sites. They were put on the backs of these trucks of various sorts and driven away. Some of the release sites, Sabine did not let any Anglo-Saxon looking people go on the trip for fear of attracting more attention to what was happening. At other release sites we were allowed to go, and I got to go on one release. Transporting the turtles up into the forest was challenging. At a couple of sites, we used these water buffaloes and sleds. These sleds are really impressive. They're much better than anything with wheels on them. These branches just sort of slide along the ground. They slide up and over branches. And some of these trails, we'd encounter like trees down across the trail that were 2 feet thick. And the water buffalo would just keep walking, and these sleds would just kind of slide up over the tree and down the other side. And the whole thing stayed completely stable. Once we got to the streams, it was a group effort to move turtles down and just start releasing them. These are just a bunch of release images. Along the way, while the turtles were at the center, many of the females had been gravid, which means sort of the egg-laying equivalent of pregnant. So gravid turtles were laying their eggs at the center. Here's Sabine showing you some of these really big individual eggs. And the good news is many of these eggs were successfully incubated and started to hatch. Sabine just sent this image last week of a hatchling from the confiscation. So a little bit of good news there. We collected a lot of biomedical samples, and because this species is so rare, there's very few of them in museum collections around the world. So people that want to study turtle evolution or turtle taxonomy need to get their hands on individuals, like at the Museum of Natural History here in Boston. So we know that there's only a few of these turtles in museums already, so we preserved some by injecting them with formaldehyde, and keeping them intact for future museum specimens. We also collected all the samples that I mentioned too. Now the problem here is because these are an endangered species and CITES listed and IUCN critically endangered, and the Filipino government has regulations, we can't just move these without further discussion. So we do have export permits pending in the Philippines, but there appears to be a little bit of political stumbling there too about whether we're actually going to be able to get these samples out of the country for proper analysis. These are just group photos of all the different vets and assistants, vet technicians from various organizations that came in. In the end, the total mortality of the Palawan forest turtles from this confiscation is about 11%, which is fairly high, fairly good compared to some of the other confiscations that we've dealt with, and especially when there's 4,000 of them, having only an 11% mortality rate is quite good. There's a lot of things to discuss, and some of this will come up in the questions, I'm sure, but I'll preemptively throw some things at you that you can think about. So what? So all these turtles were confiscated, we released them again, and who's to say, I'm sure you're all thinking they're going to go collect them again next week, and that's what we're all thinking too. And so there's obviously, this is not the end of the story. But from a medical standpoint or a veterinary standpoint, you know, if we had a big catastrophe and a bunch of humans were hospitalized and then majority of them were made healthy again and went back to their lives, it doesn't mean that they're never going to die, and you know, there's never going to be anything bad that happens. But we felt like, at least from a medical standpoint, being able to release most of them was a good thing. There's a lot of political stuff going on, and you know, people that work in true global conservation tell us that it's not really about the animals or about veterinarians caring for animals that's going to protect any of these things. It's politics and working within political boundaries to create a change of political atmosphere and culture where habitats and species can be protected. The law enforcement in the Philippines is problematic, and this is true in a lot of places. You know, if you're in Africa and you're law enforcement and you know your family is going to be killed and your daughter's going to be raped, and if you try to prosecute a poacher, you might think twice about it. Or if you can make a lot of money by ignoring a poacher, you might think about doing that. So in the Philippines so far, despite the fact that, as I'll show you, they have laws about this stuff, no one has been prosecuted for this case yet. They know who owned the warehouse where they were. They know that they have people that were working there, and nothing has happened to any of them yet. And if you watch some of the videos that you can see online about this where they interview the government, they'll say, oh, we're still gathering information, and who knows how long that kind of thing goes on. Global wildlife trade is strong, and this is just a little glimpse of it. You know, there's economic and political things that are driving this. And humans are humans, and we'll keep doing stupid things and wanting more and wanting rare things for ourselves and wanting to have a rhino horn on our mantle or a rare turtle in our live turtle collection. I've circled here the wildlife laws. I don't know how well you can read it, but yeah, it looks pretty good. Anyway, the Philippine wildlife laws are based on the IUCN status of the turtles, of the animal. So these turtles are critically endangered, so you look at that column that's circled in red, and people that have done this should be, for example, imprisoned for 6 to 12 years or fined 1 million Filipino pesos. And so far, nothing is happening, so that's disturbing. Who knows what some of these guys are? So who's on the left? Anybody know? The great auk, yes. Who's on the bottom? The dodo. And the top? Yeah, the Pinta Island tortoise, Lonesome George. So these are all species that people once thought were numerous. They went to islands and they saw a whole bunch of them and they said, hey, we can hunt a bunch of these things, it's fine. And they're all extinct now. Lonesome George was the last one of the Pinta Island. It was maybe, I think, 2 or 3 years ago now. So these things happen, and it's real. And you know, when you have a turtle species like this that's only on this one island in the whole world, and you start sending 4,000 of them into the illegal live animal trade, they're not going to be there for very long. So we really do feel that trying to maintain some of these things is important. So I know you often leave lectures like this feeling discouraged, like there's nothing you can do, and in some ways there is nothing that some of us as individuals can do. I can provide veterinary care to these turtles, but I'm not going to be the one that you know, convinces the Filipino government to prosecute somebody. So in general, there are ways to avoid illegal wildlife trade. So as you know, we shouldn't be buying tortoiseshell jewelry and ivory products and all these sorts of things. Even buying wild animals, there are still places, you know, pet stores that you can go that are dealing in wild caught animals, and in some cases it's probably not the end of the world, but really we should probably be moving away from these hobbies that we have and desires that we have that make us want wild animals in our homes. There's a lot of groups that do good work. So I've got acronyms here. The Turtle Survival Alliance has a great website, turtlesurvival.org. Turtle Survival Center is their facility in South Carolina where they're trying to breed a lot of these rare species. The Turtle Conservancy, turtleconservancy.org, is a great organization that's spending a ton of money all over the world buying habitat and protecting turtle species. And then on a bigger scale, organizations like World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, any of these groups that are working on a political scale and on a landscape scale to protect species. These are all organizations that are worth supporting. And even locally, like I said, if you're not one that wants to focus on global, you want to focus on here in Massachusetts, there's plenty of species that need attention. People like Brian Windmiller and his group, Grassroots Wildlife, Mass Wildlife, that's our state wildlife agency, has a natural heritage program, and donations or volunteering your time to any of those sorts of effort can make you feel like you are helping with some of these things. You don't have to look at any of this other than this is just to show you lots of organizations helped, and these are individual people that contributed a lot of money to be able to do this whole Philippine thing. So if any of you are on this list, thank you. If any of you donated, thank you. Angel Memorial Animal Hospital here in Boston donated a lot. Tufts donated. New England Aquarium donated. I'm almost out of time. I just wanted to show a few slice of life slides unrelated to the turtles. Working on these guys was pretty gross. They were peeing on us and pooping on us, and there were flies everywhere, and it was 90 degrees and it was humid. And you'd come home at the end of the day completely saturated and smelling horrible. So I realized pretty quickly that a lot of the clothes that I brought with me were ineffective for that situation. So in the end, I ended up wearing the same scrub top every day and the same nylon wind pants every day because they dried quickly. And most of us were talking about this every day, like how can we stay clean? And so we would go back and shower with our clothes on, wash ourselves up with dish soap, and then rinse all our clothes off and then hang them in front of the air conditioning fan at night, and they would usually be dry enough the next morning that you felt pretty clean about wearing them. There was poor connectivity for the most part, but it's funny now in our society that we feel like, you know, if we're in the Philippines, we ought to have internet connection all the time, and so we complained that we only had Wi-Fi when we were at our hotel. But it was a little inconvenient because the people from the West were trying to communicate with us. It's 12 hours apart. They wanted immediate feedback on their emails, and we would get them 12 hours later when we got back at night, and now they're all asleep, and we only have this amount of time. And we all sort of gathered every night and went through all of our emails and then had a meal. So this is that turtle food, the water spinach, cooked for humans with some onions and good stuff. And it's really tasty. The food was excellent. Everything was very inexpensive. The people were really nice. We never felt unsafe anywhere that we went. And it was a good overall experience, I'd say. This was an interesting place. We just went one day for lunch, and it was like this little, you know, Marty Krofft kind of place from Land of the Lost or something. It had like all of these psychedelic flowers and giant mushrooms and big hearts and peace signs everywhere. It was kind of bizarre. I didn't quite figure out how this fit into the Philippines, but it was there. And then this is just a healthy turtle ready to get let go. So thanks to the aquarium for sending me, and thanks to all the other organizations that sent people. Sabine has sent us an update recently that another big confiscation happened there last week. About 1,000 turtles were confiscated. Most of them were not Palawan forest turtles. They were more common species, but it's indicating still that the trade is still there.
I know you explained a little bit about how you went like through the day, but how do you go about organizing kind of veterinary care on such a large scale and like knowing exactly what to do and how to proceed and how to divide up that many animals?
Yeah, most of the people that were there had experience with these sorts of things, which is one of the reasons why they called the people that they called. So, for example, they know here we deal with hundreds of sea turtles that come in every year. We were one of the groups involved with the oil spill response a few years ago. So once you do some of these large-scale efforts a couple of times, you have a sense of what systems will work and how to, you basically need someone at the top that's calling the shots for the day, dividing people out into groups, having a pretty standard treatment protocol so that you're not trying to devise, you know, an individual protocol for every animal with that many animals, and then sort of ballparking the weights of the animals too. We weren't trying to weigh every single one of them. We had like, you know, if this animal is this big and this one's medium and this one's small, if we give them these 3 doses, it's probably going to be within some range of a reasonably safe dose for that animal. So those were the main ways, and then, you know, as you get fewer animals, you can convert a little bit more into individual animal care, but even when you have a few hundred, it's still hard to treat them as individuals. And you probably make mistakes. There are probably some that get treated that didn't need it, and some that didn't get treated that needed it, and some you're using a drug that's not going to be effective for them, and you should be using some other drug if you were doing cultures on everybody, for example, you know. We tried wearing gloves, and we found that it was so humid there that our hands were getting filled with water under the glove. We were sweating so much, and the turtles were ripping through the gloves a lot. And so after going through a few boxes of gloves and still needing more and trying to get new gloves on when your hands are completely wet each time, we decided we would just use buckets of water, rinse our hands frequently, and we did have soap and Purell type hand disinfectants. So we were doing that pretty frequently to try to keep our hands clean. But you're right, here when we're working with turtles and other animals, we wear gloves all the time, but it just was becoming impractical. Yeah?
Were the 1,000 that were just found in the same warehouse?
No, the most recent confiscation was in the north end of the island, a city called Tay-Tay or Tai-Tai, I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's within the natural range of this turtle. The warehouse that was involved in the bigger confiscation was in the south, and so it probably is just indicating how widespread this network is, and they are using a number of different ports around the island to get the turtles onto ships to leave the island.
And then is there any resources going to the center where you work with them to make it better or more updated?
Yeah, not at the PWRC where we were for this confiscation, but the Katala Foundation itself has a separate campus. I didn't show you any images of that. It's actually a much better facility already than what this is. And so most of the funding that's going to building capacity is going to the Katala Center's campus to expand the existing turtle enclosures there. Yeah.
Is there going to be any follow-up science or research to see how many of these guys that you released have survived?
Yes, the question is about follow-up of the guys that were released. Sabine's team is already doing that, so they've already got all of the students involved with going back to the release sites and monitoring them. They have found a few animals dead at release sites so far, but they have not found any really widespread evidence that the release sites have been discovered so far, but I don't know how long that will last. Yeah. Yes?
Did you permanently mark the turtles prior to release?
They were marked as a cohort, so all of the animals had a filed notch in the same marginal scute of their carapace so that they can at least be identified to that confiscation to some, crude degree of certainty. But no, they didn't get like a microchip or an individual notching pattern or anything like that. Yes?
Is there any way that you could relocate the turtles without introducing them as invasive species?
Can you relocate the turtles? Do you mean to other islands, other countries? Yeah. In some ways we did that. With the release, the turtles were put into good habitat, but not necessarily into known locations where they were before. So in a small scale, they did get spread out to other environments where they might not be already. When you get into the concept of moving turtles to completely different countries, it's another story, and a lot of discussion and thought has to go into that. That is happening a little bit now. There's been the very first reintroductions of some turtles that were raised in the US into environments in Myanmar happened recently, and also in China recently. But there has to be a lot of thought put into stuff like that for infectious disease problems and genetics problems. But yeah, and the other question that came up was, should we have just kept a bunch of these and spread them out amongst zoos and aquariums around the world? You can debate about that kind of thing too. It may be a decent idea, but the Philippine government wasn't ready to permit that yet. And that was not what the IUCN edict was at this point yet either. But that may become necessary. That's what they did with the California condor when there were so few left. They captured everyone they could find, they brought them in, and they bred them in captivity.
How many turtles did you think that you were going to save?
How many did I think I would say?
4,000 turtles.
Out of 4,000? Oh, I don't know. In a good year here with our sea turtles, about 70% of what come in we keep alive to be able to be released again. In other confiscations I've dealt with, we've lost all of them. We had a confiscation of Sulawesi forest turtles a few years ago in the US at LAX and the airport, and they got distributed to a bunch of zoos. It turns out these tortoises had a virus that had never been seen before in the world, and it was 100% fatal, and they all died. So you never know when you go into these things if you're dealing with really hot infectious agents that are going to kill all of them, or if they are just sort of debilitated and dehydrated and they'll get better in a few days. Thanks for coming. I appreciate your concern, and try to help in any way you can.